Good morning, everyone. I'm Helen Torres, CEO of HOPE, Hispanas Organized for Political Equality. Welcome to the media release of Leading with HOPE, Supporting Latina Leaders for a Better California. We are joined this morning by various members of the media, some of the participants highlighted in the report, USC researchers, HOPE team members, and our HOPE board chair, Rosie Arroyo. Thank you for making the time. We are recording this briefing and will make the recording available to the public. At the end of the report, we invite the members of the media to please identify themselves with their name and their media outlet and submit their questions via the Q&A box. Our introduction of HOPE, followed by a 20-minute presentation on the report, and we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. To get started, please feel free to drop your name in the chat box and identify where you're joining us from. For those of you who are not familiar with HOPE, it is a nonpartisan nonprofit organization committed to ensuring political and economic parity for Latinas through leadership, advocacy, and education to benefit all communities and the status of women. For 32 years, HOPE's innovative programming has served over 64,000 Latinas, let me get that right, 64,000 Latinas, and touched the lives of several thousand more through our advocacy efforts. We are proud of being a voice for Latinas and the advocates and advocating on behalf of Latinas. Inspired by the leadership of Latinas and witnessing the lack of opportunities Latinas were presented with, HOPE started the HOPE Leadership Institute program in 1999. The HOPE Leadership Institute is the first and only statewide leadership program specifically designed for Latinas in California. The goal of the Institute is to train Latinas in vital leadership skills and advocacy skills, enabling them to create fundamental change in their local communities and neighborhoods, and to benefit across California. The Leadership Institute, after 23 years of training and supporting Latinas through our leadership programs, we were confronted with a barrier, HOPE was confronted with a barrier we knew needed to be removed: the lack of resources being dedicated to the development and support of Latina leaders. We were set out to prove why investing in Latina leaders was instrumental to our democracy and economic well-being of the state. We are proud to share this study, Leading with HOPE, Supporting Latina Leaders for a Better California, because it proves what we already knew, that the impact that Latinas are making is positive throughout California, and we are uplifting our communities. It is a pleasure to introduce two of the authors of the report to start reviewing the report specifically, and that is our great Dr. Manuel Pastor, Director of USC Equity Research Institute, and the incredible Cynthia Moreno, Data Analyst of UC Equity Research Institute. Thank you both for joining us, and we look forward to the details of the report.
Yes, so good morning, everyone. I will just share my screen quickly. Manuel, would you like to say a word? Perfect. I hope you can all see the presentation mode, not my notes. Great. So good morning, everyone. Thanks for the nod. Good morning, everyone. My name is Cynthia Moreno, Data Analyst 2 at the USC Equity Research Institute. And I'm joined by our director, Dr. Manuel Pastor, and we'll be going over the findings, the main high-level takeaways and findings of our new report, Leading with HOPE, and then diving into a Q&A afterwards. So feel free to throw those in the chat box as they pop up, and we'll address those at the end. I'll just say very quickly, working on this effort has been a pleasure for myself and our team. It's been so great to work with the leadership at HOPE and also the incredible women who are a part of their HOPE Leadership Institute alumni-based network. I know some of you all are here. Thank you so much for contributing yourselves to this report. We hope that it's a testament to all of your accomplishments and the ways that you contribute to your community. So again, just thank you for helping us in all of this. So with that, we will dive right in to, or starting with the objective of our research, which you all have already heard a bit about from Helen, but this endeavor came about in recognition of the vast presence that Latinas hold in the state of California, which you will see when Manuel takes the mic and goes over our demographic section. But beyond that, beyond the sheer size and numbers that Latinas hold in the state, we also wanted to recognize that many Latinas are already leading in so many important ways across issue area and across sector. And this is happening with very little dedicated investment in their leadership development and And so in effort to highlight those impacts, this report narrows in on a specific group of Latinas, and that is the Alumni-Based Leadership Institute, otherwise known as HLI. That's how I'll be referring to them from now on, who were a part of the HLI program and thus gained access to the HLI network. We aim to show that this group and network of women is just an example of what happens and how California benefits when Latinas and Latina-led programming are invested in. And you'll see on the slide here, it's an overview of our methods, our methodology that we can go deeper into if there's any questions at the end, but as an overview, we embarked on literature review of existing research, analysis of statewide demographic and economic data, and then kind of a three-pronged data collection process, which included an in-depth survey, one-on-one interviews, and 3 regional focus groups. So our report is organized into 3 following areas, starting with our first finding on how it is that these Latina leaders have learned to lead or strengthen their existing leadership capacities, with a strong focus on how HOPE and the HLI network has contributed to that, and why a network such as this is so important to their success and their trajectories. 2, how and where Latina leaders have led or are currently leading civically, politically, and economically. And 3, how it is that Latinas are leading for all. Of course, keeping an eye on issues that affect Latino communities, but also communities of color at large, as well as prioritizing or keeping an eye on the future by prioritizing passing the baton to those coming up after them, and in an effort to keep increasing representation of those who have been historically excluded from places of power and leadership. So with that, I will pass it on to Manuel to go over our California.
Great, thank you, Cynthia. And what would any report from the Equity Research Institute be if it didn't have tons of demographic data? So let's take a look at the situation of Latinas in the state of California. First thing for you to realize is that Latinas are actually the plurality of women in the state. 39% of the women in the state are Latina. The second largest ethnic group is non-Hispanic whites, followed by the Asian Pacific Islanders. So Latinas are a very important group in terms of their numbers. Now, as many of you know, the whole question of what is a Latina could have been an entire report unto itself. How do people define themselves? How do they define themselves racially as well? The next slide shows you now in the state of California in the 2015-2019 period, Latinos were identifying racially. What's interesting here is that about 60% of Latinas, when actually marking the race question as well, marked it as white, and about 38% marked it as mixed or other. Those numbers have likely changed as a result of the change in the wording in the 2020 census. We've written about how that census has allowed people to go beyond the simple binary choices. But it's very important to realize that the Latina identity itself is a mestizaje of different ethnicities, different races, and certainly indigenous origins, one important community that we talk a bit about in the report. Next slide. Well, why is this so important? Well, if you look at the data I just presented, 39% of women in the state are Latina, but 43% of the mothers in the state are Latina. And if you ask the question, who's raising the children, of the children in the state, 17 years old and other, 52%, more than half, have a Latina mother. Now, why so many children? Part of it is a major difference in the median age of whites and Latinos in the state. For non-Hispanic Latinos, the median age is around 46. For Latinas and Latinos, the median age is around 29, so much closer to childbearing age. But what this fundamentally tells us is that Latinas are not only a big share of the state currently, but they're key to the future of the state in many ways, including raising the next generation. Next slide. So how are Latinas doing and what needs to be done to make sure that they thrive? One of the challenges that's faced for the Latina community, and here we're comparing Latinas and non-Latinas, women only, in the ages 25 to 64, sort of prime working age, is that there's a huge issue with people, Latinas, who have less than a high school degree. Much of this is concentrated in the immigrant population, some of it concentrated in the native born as well. But you can see here that as we move to folks who have a BA or higher, that for non-Latinas women, about 48% of non-Latina women in the state have a BA or more. That's only 16% of Latinas. So that is going to affect economic prospects. It's going to affect the way in which people look to deliver educational and leadership programs, to cultivate new leaders and not necessarily see the leaders who are there who may not have a formal education. This is part of what HOPE does, but big educational disparities, you can imagine how that plays out economically. However, next slide. It's important for you to realize that the economic distress that many Latinas, in particular Latinos who are adding families, face is not simply a function of a lack of education and therefore an inability to gain a good toehold in the labor market. If you look here, when we're comparing non-Latina women to Latinas, at every educational level, less than a high school diploma, with a high school diploma, some college with an AA degree, and interestingly, with a BA or higher, what you see is that at each and every educational level, Latinas are doing worse than non-Latinas in terms of their earnings. And what's particularly striking is what's going on for the population that has a BA or more, that is actually one of the biggest dollar level differences in terms of the median wage. And by the way, this is for full-time year-round employees between Latinas and non-Latinas. What helps to explain that gap in terms of a return to education? Well, education and credentials matter, but so do networks. The ability to know who's in a position to help you out economically, who's in a position to help you move to a leadership position. And part of what the HOPE leadership program tries to do is to create those kind of lasting networks so that these wage gaps can be closed and the leadership gaps can be closed as well. Next slide. Now, one reason why that's so important is because of the role of Latinas in particular in terms of civic engagement. This is something that we've known for a while. When you look at, for example, the naturalization data, women, Latinas, tend to naturalize at much higher rate than men, Latinos. And a well-targeted naturalization program is going to target women who seem to have a propensity to naturalize and understand that you can use those women, those Latinas, as ambassadors to get the rest of their families to naturalize as well. And you could see that it shows up here too in terms of voting. So this is looking at citizen respondents and asking the question for US-born Latino men, naturalized Latino men, US-born Latino women, naturalized Latina women, what is the share of people who actually voted who were citizens in the 2020 general campaign? And what you'll notice here is a lamentable fact, the fact that Latino men vote at fairly low rates, but a fact that one should build on, that Latinas vote at much higher rates than Latino men. So if you're looking to spur civic engagement, you need to be very interested in Latinas and in Latina leadership development, and that is what we turn to next.
Yes, thank you so much, Manuel. With all of that context in mind, we'll dive into the findings of our data collection efforts, and we'll begin with a taste of what we found in our survey. Slide, which again was a pool of about 275 Hope HLI alumni, though not everyone completed the survey. There were over 200 respondents, so that was great. And here I'll just go over the main bullet points, but all of the questions that we asked are included in our report. Here are just the major takeaways. Over half of the women surveyed are second generation to this country, so they have at least one immigrant parent. About 1 in every 5, or 20%, are immigrants themselves. Racially, 51% identified as white, followed by 45% identified as multiracial or other, which is, as you might remember, comparable to how Latinas racially identify statewide. So it is pretty representative of our statewide population as well. And last, over 70% are first generation college students. Below on the second half of the slide, you'll see we get a glimpse of where these women have ended up professionally. So the public sector was represented the most at 40%, and this includes positions in education, governmental agencies, elected officials themselves, as well as their staff. Over 70% are full-time workers, 15% employ themselves, and 61% devote their time to other meaningful type of positions, such as serving on boards and commissions, which we also go into great detail on in the report. So diving into our first finding, which describes the role that HOPE and the HLI network have played in how alumni have learned to lead or strengthened their existing leadership skills. Alumni consistently highlighted how the HLI network delivers both the professional guidance that they were looking for, as well as the personal support that quickly became very necessary in order to tackle those professional opportunities and access those professional opportunities. And so a subsection of this in our report goes into a discussion about how this network, in addition to the professional opportunities that it provided, also provided women with that personal support and specifically of overcoming challenges and systemic barriers that many women had faced throughout their trajectories. So for example, the quote that you see here is from a woman who serves as a council person for the city of Fresno, and she describes the power that she feels when she reminds herself of this support system that she has access to, specifically as she navigated running for office for the first time. Other interviewees throughout the report, you'll see exemplified how that personal support gives them the energy or the energy or the confidence that they need to feel in order to make impact professionally or push themselves professionally. So that's kind of how HLI alumni, Latinas of this specific group, harness their network. The chart below here shows how that network then has ripple effects on their communities. So 61% of women surveyed have contributed to youth leadership development, and you see that over half of the surveyed create community impact in other ways, such as contributing to legislative hearings, local political campaigns, etc. So all of this goes to exemplify how women of this network have been equipped with a network that offers possibility, as well as personal support that is necessary to tackle those possibilities, and are contributing to California in diverse and impactful ways. Our second finding, which is probably the meatiest of them all in our report, it details the vast accomplishments that this group of Latinas, that these alumni have made in work and in their communities. Myself, along with the rest of the interview team, had the privilege of hearing countless stories and examples of alumni changing policy, creating job opportunities, winning funding for important programs, advocating for ocean conservation, and testifying in Congress, and many, many other really incredible things. And all of these accomplishments are important to recognize. They've been able to happen with only some intentional support from organizations like HOPE. And so it does beg the question, what more could be possible? How much more these women and others, following in their footsteps, could accomplish with even more institutional support. And so this quote here shows how one interviewee, who was actually the Secretary of California Business, Consumer Services, and Housing, harnessed her skills to have a broader and even national impact. She shared that her California-based housing program demonstrated success of public housing residents, and so it was scaled up to a nationwide program, which exemplifies just how far-reaching some of their work is. Their impact is also extended to creating opportunities for others in their own backyards. For example, at least 6 of the women that we interviewed have created wholly new organizations in their respective regions that revolve around building leadership and building more leaders, bringing them into the fold. And that's at least partly reflected in our survey, where over 90% of the surveyed mentor at least one person. And the chart here kind of goes a little bit deeper into what the inspiration or goal is behind mentorship. And you'll see the most cited goal here is to increase the number of Latinas pursuing professional degrees. So again, just opening possibilities for even more folks. Finally, we found that Latina leadership leads with an eye towards equity, specifically racial equity, and also in respect to the ongoing pandemic. This outlook is exemplified here by our first quote by the City of San Jose's Director of Office of Racial Equity, who's also an HLI alumni. She stated that if we're interested in advancing racial equity, then we need to acknowledge the impacts of race and center race in decision making, so that outcomes for Latinos and communities of color at large truly do improve. The quote on the bottom right is actually from an alumni who works at San Isidro Health, who referenced an accomplishment of another HLI alumni and shared how she brought that equity outlook and framework to practice. So in light of the effects of COVID-19, she highlighted how one alumna, Mara Vargas of the San Diego County Board of Supervisors, mobilized with an equitable lens that prioritized COVID-19 resources going to areas that were most afflicted with the disease, which I believe led to the outcome of over 90% vaccination rate in her specific area. And finally, the chart here shows what respondents said when we asked them about what they believe HLI alumni have been able to contribute to systemic change, and influencing local politicians emerged as the most chosen option, followed by influencing local commissions and boards, which isn't a surprise because in our interviews we talked extensively about their impact on boards and commissions, and then that's followed by advocating for justice and healthcare access. So all of which are supported by our interviewing experiences as well. So that was a very quick overview, but you'll see in our report, we go into much more nuance and much more detail, specifically around how Latinas of this network give back to HOPE as well as an organization, but also give back to one another and make sure to keep an eye on how it is that they can help their fellow alumni, and also the type of bonds that are created amongst alumni and how it is that those bonds help propel them into bigger and better spaces. And so, yeah, with that, I will pass it on to Manuel for our final lesson takeaways.
Great, thank you. And as Cynthia mentioned in the report itself, there's a lot more detail on what the survey said and what experiences were. And boy, there's a ton of quotes and great stories in there. So I really want to thank the team for collecting all of those. So what are the sort of main lessons we pull away that we think are important for philanthropy, for the public sector and political leaders, and for the private sector as well? So first, for whatever set of reasons, and I can speculate, Latinas tend to advocate for issues that managed historically marginalized communities. Many Latinas are themselves from communities where there have been the ravages of xenophobia and uncertain immigration status and generations of exclusion. And all of that makes people very sensitive to role when people are marginalized. So there's a tendency to lead with that, and more can be done to expand the roles of Latinas in leading in all sorts of work and broadening issue sets. It would be remiss, for example, if I didn't mention a new book by a colleague called Refusing Death, a woman named Professor named Nadia Kim at Loyola Marymount University, which points to the key role of Latinas on moving environmental justice in the state of California. This is not an issue that's gender specific. It's not even sort of Latino specific, but it is something that if you look at nearly every piece of legislation, particularly the early stuff, EJ, it was actually put in place by Latinas. And if you look at the leadership around that issue, very important leadership of Latinas. Second key point we want to take away is what we keep coming back to, that networks of support help Latinas magnify their talents and reach. It actually helps improve their incomes as well. And so what that means is that boosting networks and boosting mentorship, which yield big dividends, both for Latinas themselves and actually for the state's economy and state's political leadership. Third, Latinos are making progress. If you look at the political representation of Latinas, it certainly improved over the last few decades, with some credit due to HOPE and its determined effort to cultivate new leaders who are unafraid of running for office and unafraid of asking for the funding that they themselves do not have in their own social networks to be able to launch the campaigns that they need. But if we want more political representation, we need to address those gaps. For example, the racial wealth gaps, which affect Black Californians and Latino Californians in terms of their initial wealth and their networks and their ability to run for political office. And that's going to require specific investments. Fourth, Latinas tend to create bridges through multiracial efforts. We saw over and over again when asked about issues, what Latinas were raising were issues not simply specific to those of the Latino community, but issues that affected working class communities, that affected Black communities, that affected AAPI communities, and understood the need to link these efforts. So it's important that leadership programs encourage collaboration and intersectionality to be able to build those muscles, develop those skills to keep practicing building broad movements that reflect all of California. Next slide. So this is something that we've said over and over again, but Latinas tend to lead with racial equity and economic justice in mind. Again, I think if you look back at the data and think about what a large share are either, I think it's on the order of 75% are either second generation or immigrants themselves, you know that what people have understood is that they're coming often from poor families, working class families, and that economic justice is central. Six, that there are numerous barriers to Latinas becoming leaders. We've talked a little bit about some of them with regard to networks, but we heard so many stories also of corporate heads of foundations, et cetera, not necessarily seeing Latinas as leaders, and people, young Latinas, feeling unseen, out of place, not encouraged. And with a little bit of encouragement, with a little bit of lifting the professional barriers that exist, Latinas can thrive, and they can thrive in their leadership in ways, as we'll get to, that benefits the whole state. But in order to do that, we need to have organizations that can create and promote pipelines. HOPE is one of those, but there are others and others that need to be developed. And they need to start with the reach to young people, to Latinas who are in high school, maybe even junior high school, and to Latinas certainly in places like community colleges, which are not often thought of as incubators of leadership talent, but it's where so many of our young people are going. So we need pipelines, and they need to have a deep reach into the community. And 8, what we need to be doing is to be making an argument that does not simply say that we need Latina leadership because we want Latinas to be represented and Latina issues to be of paramount concern. We need to be making the case, which seems to be apparent from the data, that Latina leadership benefits the entire state. When you've got more than half the children being raised by Latinas, when you see Latinas leading on economic issues, on environmental issues, on social issues more broadly, even on reproductive rights, what you begin to understand is that this is leadership that benefits the entire state. And it is simply criminal that the level of investment in Latina leadership is so low when there is such a high yield for everyone that could be garnered by more investments. So thank you for your time. And I think we turn things back over to Helen.
Thank you, Dr. Pastor and Cynthia. My name is Maya Gomez. I'm with the HOPE team, and I will moderate this Q&A portion of our session. There's a question from Juan Esparza Loera from Vida en el Valle in Fresno. Their question is, what regions in the state are in greater need of training or outreach to get Latinas more involved as advocates? is the San Joaquin Valley adequately represented politically by Latinas?
Do you want me to take that one, Dr. Pastor? Okay, great. Thank you so much for being on the Zoom with us. I would say all regions of the state need more Latino representation, and we're not quite at even close being at equity. But you do point out that the Central Valley is going through an incredible shift in leadership and has a great opportunity to ensure that part of that shift is that Latina voices and Latinas have more opportunities for political empowerment. So I would point out the Central Valley, the Coachella Valley, and the Inland Empire are three key areas of focus and need of additional resources. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Helen.
I
There's
would
a
just add, I would add one thing to it.
Mhm.
I think that, again, we sometimes think about equity between regions as being simply an issue of fairness. I just really want to suggest that if you look at the data, where the population is growing is in inland California, largely because of housing prices. If you look at the share of the population that are children in a place like Fresno County, the share of people who are population as children is almost twice that of, for example, San Francisco. And if you look at the projections, the share of people who are children on the coast will be going down, and it'll be going down a little bit, but not quite as much in inland California over the next 30 or 40 years. So that's where the future of the state is. And so we need to be making these hard, and if you look at the economic development opportunities that are likely to emerge in the Inland Empire because of logistics, and Imperial County and Coachella because of lithium, you're really talking about the future of the state. And so we need to be making sure that that leadership is there, not simply for the fairness reasons, that injustice reasons that many of us feel dear to our heart, but if you want to make sure that that economic development actually benefits communities and benefits children, the kind of leadership that we've seen amongst the Hope alumni and other Latina leaders is absolutely critical.
Thank you, Dr. Pastor. We have a question from Carolyn Cabias and Itzel Sanchez, which is, will the demographic info be available after the program? I believe it's all in the report, but if Cynthia, if you want to clarify, that'd be great.
Yes, so it's all in the report. Yes, and as Manuel just said, there's a lot more in there. The average, I think Manuel did speak to it, but the average age is also in there. We have a lot more. So I don't know if we can drop the link in the chat, but
we'll drop that link in the chat. We do have one more anonymous question in our Q&A. Could you elaborate on the data collected with regards to pay equity? For example, only 42% of Latinas advocate for pay equity. Shouldn't we be at 100% advocacy? How do you suggest we increase?
Yeah, I can take that one. I think that was just by virtue of how the question was worded. I think it asked participants to kind of check boxes of what are top priorities for them in their work. So it may be possible that generally all 100% of alumni would advocate for pay equity, but they don't necessarily do that as part of their professional work. So I hope that clarifies.
I would add one thing to that, which is I think that we are often taught to believe, brainwashed, that education is what makes the difference. And that when you see pay differentials, that it must be due to educational differences. And so we have a very individualistic story about how people can do well, and a very individualistic story about why people do poorly. So if you looked at the raw difference in wages between Latinas and non-Latina women, you would see even bigger gaps, of course. And some of that is due to education. Some of that, particularly at the lower educational levels, is due to immigration status. But that's the reason why we include the chart about pay equity by education level, because it makes it clear that that individualistic story that education alone will make the difference is not sufficient, that we need collective organizing to get rid of discrimination in labor markets, that we actually need collective organizing so that immigration status isn't a barrier to people's economic success or leadership possibilities. So I think it's so easy for everyone to get into the Horatio Alger, my situation must be the result of my effort, instead of understanding that people are working hard and not being able to get ahead because of the legacies. You've got in the report, there's these great stories, and I don't know, Cindy, if you want to say a little bit about it, but they'll just offer a little color detail on it of women running for office and realizing that they simply don't have the friend network that has sufficient amount of money. That isn't because they're not smart or talented or eager or enthusiastic. It's because they're coming from communities with years and years and years of redlining, of discrimination, of lack of asset building, and it makes it hard for people to get ahead. That is a structural story. That is not an individual story. Do you want to add something to that, Cynthia?
Yeah, there were multiple instances of that. The women that we spoke to, and there was at least one or two quotes that come to mind that didn't make it into the report about that experience, about not feeling equipped, not having the social capital, the network available that was, well versed in fundraising and campaigning, and how, weird it also is culturally to ask family for donations or ask family and friends for support in that way when we're very aware that that might not be a possibility given the communities that we come from. So yeah, that's definitely discussed. And how Hope and the HLN network helps to bridge that and address that issue.
Thank you. We do have one more question from Juan Esparza, and Helen, maybe you can answer this one. How many more funds are needed for programs that prepare Latinas for these leadership roles?
Thank you for that, Juan. I would look at it from two angles. One is overall, when we were doing the research, we knew that both Latino and Latina-led organizations were receiving less than 2% of the philanthropic dollars that's across the United States. Here in California, some of the research shows that women of color, which is inclusive of Latinas and African-American women and other women of different ethnicities and races, was less than 0.05%. We would like to see that the philanthropic efforts, at least here in California, would strive for and try to reach that 20% that is reflective of the women that we serve and reflective of the demographic of the state. So we've got a long road ahead of us, but that is what we will be advocating for. Now, for Hope to specifically expand our programming, the Hope Leadership Institute, our youth programming in servicing more women, we have done the calculation that we hope to raise an additional 4.5 million over the next 3 years to double the amount of women that we're training annually. So that is our personal commitment that we're trying to achieve. But part of that commitment is lifting up all organizations that are doing good work in the Latino and Latina community and making sure that our communities and our women are getting their fair share of those philanthropic and investment dollars.
Thank you, Helen. I hope that answers Juan's question. It doesn't look like we have any more questions. So Helen, I invite you just to wrap us up here. Thank you so much, Dr. Pastor and Cynthia Moreno.
Helen, might I say a word before?
Yes, absolutely.
I just want to acknowledge that while two of the report authors are presenting today, and Cynthia, good job, that there were 3 other authors who were really key. Dalia Gonzalez, who did a lot of some of the interviewing and writing, and Harpita Sharma, who did a lot of our careful data collection and processing, and Rachel Rosner, who along with Cynthia Moreno actually really led this project and helped to design exactly what we do. There's an army of other people at the Equity Research Institute that contributed in multiple ways, but those 3 co-authors in particular deserve to have their names lifted up in a session in which we're trying to make sure that women's work gets recognized rather than undercounted. I wanted to make sure that those 3 names were lifted up as well.
Thank you so much, Dr. Manuel Pastor. The whole team over at USC ERI has been incredible. And I'm happy to point out that a good majority of them are Latinas. So you're in good company, Dr. Pastor. So with that, I do want to welcome and thank everyone, or thank you all for staying with us this past 43 minutes and just highlight a couple of takeaways. One, Latinas are a demographic force. Largest share of the women in the state of California. We are the largest share of women of mothers and raising more than half of the children in the state. Latinas are already leading, and we're leading with equity in mind, as amplified in the stories that we uncovered in the report. And their leadership, our leadership, is important to amplify by programs like HOPE. There are plenty of good programs out there that need the investment to support Latina leadership. And Latinas are leading for all, centering equity and racial justice in their work, and their investment in an investment in Latina leadership is an investment in California. So I will leave you with those 3 key points, and thank you all again for taking the time of learning more about our report, about the Hope Leadership Institute, and I hope you all have a fantastic afternoon.